The night I found that briefcase, I was one decision away from becoming someone I wouldn't recognize. The rain hammered against the windshield like it was trying to break in, each drop loud enough to keep me awake even though my body begged for sleep, and the engine of my old Toyota Corolla idled in uneven breaths like it might give up before I did. The clock on the dashboard blinking 2:17 a.m. in a dim, tired glow while my son slept curled up in the back seat under a thin blanket that wasn't enough for the cold creeping in through the cracked windows, and I sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing, trying to figure out how tomorrow was supposed to look any different from today when I had exactly $12 in my wallet, half a tank of gas, and nowhere left to go. I used to think rock bottom would feel dramatic, like something you'd notice when it happened, but it doesn't. It's quiet. It's slow. It's realizing you've been surviving on small miracles for so long that when they stop, there's nothing left underneath you. I wiped the condensation from the glass with the sleeve of my hoodie and leaned back, closing my eyes for just a second, just long enough to pretend I was somewhere else, somewhere warm, somewhere safe, somewhere with a door that locked and a bed that didn't fold down from the back seat. But the sound of tires splashing through a puddle nearby snapped me back, headlights sweeping past and disappearing, leaving the street empty again except for me and the soft hum of streetlights flickering. Overhead, I exhaled slowly, my breath visible in the cold air, and reached for the crumpled receipt on the passenger seat. Doing the math again, even though I already knew the answer wouldn't change, rent I couldn't pay, a job I lost 2 weeks ago, a landlord who didn't care about reasons, just deadlines, and a future that felt like it was shrinking by the hour. I twisted in my seat to check on my son, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead as he shifted slightly, but didn't wake, his small hand still clutching the edge of the blanket like it was the only thing tethering him to something stable, and something in my chest tightened in a way that made it hard to breathe because he deserved more than this, more than cold nights and whispered reassurances I wasn't sure I could keep, more than watching his mother try to hold together a life that kept slipping through her fingers. I turned back around, and that's when I saw it, sitting on the floor behind the passenger seat where I hadn't noticed it before, a black leather briefcase, clean, expensive, completely out of place in a car that smelled like fast food and exhaustion. And for a second, I just stared at it, my mind slow to catch up, replaying the last few hours, the late-night cleaning job, the rides I picked up, the passengers who came and went without looking at me twice, and none of it made sense except for one thing. Someone had left it behind. I leaned over, pulling it closer, the leather smooth under my fingers, heavier than I expected when I lifted it onto my lap. The clasps locked tight. No name, no tag, nothing to tell me who it belonged to, just the quiet weight of something important, something valuable, something that didn't belong in my world, and yet was suddenly sitting right in front of me like a test I hadn't asked for. My heart started beating faster, not from fear, not exactly, but from something sharper, something more dangerous, possibility, and I swallowed hard, glancing at the rearview mirror where my son slept unaware, then back at the briefcase resting in my hands, the rain still falling, the night still holding its breath, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something shift, not hope, not yet, but something close enough to make me hesitate. I did not open it right away because opening it would make it real, and real meant I had a choice to make that I was not ready to face. So I just sat there with the briefcase on my lap, feeling the weight of it press into my thighs like it was asking me a question I could not ignore, and my fingers hovered over the clasps while my mind raced through every possible outcome, every version of what could happen next if I chose one path over the other. Because it was not just a briefcase, it was a line, and I was standing right on top of it. I glanced back again at my son, his breathing soft and steady, his face relaxed in a way that only kids can manage even when the world around them is falling apart. And I wondered what he would remember from all of this years from now. If he would remember the cold or the hunger or the nights in the car, or if he would only remember me, and whether that memory would be something he could be proud of or something he would quietly carry like a question he never asked out loud. My thumb brushed over the metal lock, and I felt it then. The temptation, sharp and immediate, because whatever was inside this case mattered. People did not carry something like this unless it mattered, and if it mattered, it could fix things, maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to get us a room for a few nights, enough to buy food without counting every dollar, Enough to breathe for a second without feeling like the ground was disappearing under my feet. I pressed my lips together and shook my head slightly, like I could physically push the thought away, but it did not go anywhere. It just sat there, louder now, more insistent, and I realized how easy it would be, how unbelievably easy it would be to just keep it, to drive away from this empty street and never look back, because whoever lost it would probably never find me. I was invisible. People like me always are, slipping through the edges of other people's lives without leaving a trace. The realization should have made the decision simple, but instead it made it heavier, because if no one would know, then the only person I would have to answer to was myself. I let out a slow breath and leaned my head back against the seat, closing my eyes again, not to escape this time but to listen, to the quiet, to my own thoughts, to the part of me that had not been worn down yet by everything that had gone wrong. And when I opened them, my reflection stared back at me from the dark window, tired, older than 28 should look, but still there, still me. I sat up straighter and gently set the briefcase on the passenger seat like I was putting distance between myself and something dangerous, because that is what it felt like, not dangerous in the way people think, but dangerous in the way a single decision can change who you are without you realizing it until it is too late. I reached for my phone, the screen lighting up my hands in a pale glow, and I pulled up the ride app history, scrolling through the last trips, matching faces to names, trying to remember who had been sitting in this seat, who could have left something like this behind. And one name stood out, not because it meant anything to me, but because the trip had been short, quiet. The passenger barely spoke, just gave an address and stepped out without looking back. And something about that memory made my chest tighten. I tapped on the trip details and stared at the drop-off location, a part of the city I did not belong in, the kind of place where buildings had doormen and cameras, and people who would notice if you did not fit. And my first instinct was to lock the doors and drive in the opposite direction, to stay where I was invisible, where no one asked questions, but my fingers did not move, because deep down I already knew what I was going to do. I turned the key, the engine coughing before settling into a low rumble, and adjusted the rearview mirror one more time to look at my son, memorizing the quiet of this moment before everything shifted, and I whispered under my breath, not to him, not exactly, but to myself, like a promise I could not take back. I am going to fix this the right way, even if it costs me everything. And with that, I pulled out into the empty street, the rain still falling, the city waiting, and the briefcase sitting beside me like it knew exactly where I was headed. I had not driven into that part of the city in years, and as the buildings grew taller and the streets cleaner, I became painfully aware of every sound my car made. The soft rattle in the dashboard, the uneven hum of the engine, the way my tires seemed louder against the wet pavement like they were announcing that I did not belong here. And the address on my phone pulled me deeper into a place that felt polished and distant, where even the streetlights seemed brighter and the sidewalks looked untouched by the kind of life I had been living. And I slowed down as I approached the block, my grip tightening on the steering wheel as I saw it. A building that did not just stand there, but commanded the space around it. Glass and steel rising into the night with quiet authority. A man in a dark coat standing under the overhang near the entrance like he had been placed there on purpose, watching everything without seeming to move at all. I parked across the street at first because something in me hesitated, something that recognized the invisible line between my world and theirs, and I sat there for a moment with the engine still running, the briefcase on the passenger seat catching the faint glow of the dashboard lights. And I felt that same question again, louder now, asking me if I was really going to do this, if I was really going to step out of the only place I still felt unseen and walk straight into something I could not control. I looked back at my son, still asleep, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm that grounded me more than anything else could, and I reached back to adjust the blanket around him, tucking it gently under his chin like that small act could protect him from everything waiting outside that car. And then I turned back forward and shut off the engine, the sudden silence pressing in around me like the night itself was holding its breath. The cold hit me the second I opened the door, sharp and immediate, and I pulled my hoodie tighter around me as I stepped out, grabbing the briefcase before I could change my mind, the weight of it heavier now not because it had changed, but because I had, and I crossed the street slowly, each step feeling deliberate, like I was walking into a version of my life I had not planned for. and the man by the entrance straightened just slightly as I approached, his eyes flicking to me, then to the briefcase in my hand, and I felt it then, that quiet shift in the air, like I had just been noticed in a way I had not been in a very long time. He did not speak at first, just opened the door without a word, and I hesitated for half a second before stepping inside. The warmth of the lobby wrapping around me instantly, the marble floors reflecting soft light that made everything feel unreal, like I had walked onto a set instead of into a building, and my shoes felt too loud against the polished surface, each step echoing just enough to remind me that I did not blend in here, that I stood out in a way that made me want to shrink into myself and disappear. The man followed a step behind, not close enough to touch, but close enough that I was aware of him, and he guided me toward a desk where another man stood, older, composed, his eyes sharp in a way that made it clear he missed very little, and his gaze dropped immediately to the briefcase before lifting back to my face, measuring, calculating, and for a second I almost forgot why I was there, almost let the weight of the place and the people pull me back into silence, but I forced myself to speak, my voice steady even though my heart was not. I think someone left this in my car, and I want to return it to the owner. The words hung in the air between us, simple, direct, and the man at the desk studied me for a moment longer before reaching for a phone, pressing a single button without breaking eye contact. And when he spoke, his voice was low, controlled. "Yes, she is here." And that was all he said before hanging up, and something in the way he said it made my stomach tighten, not fear exactly, but anticipation, like I had just stepped into something that was already in motion long before I arrived. I stood there holding the briefcase, my fingers steady around the handle. Even as everything around me shifted subtly, the air changing, the silence deepening, and I realized that returning it was not the end of the story like I had hoped. It was the beginning of something I could not yet see. And somewhere above me, beyond the polished floors and quiet voices, someone was already on their way down to meet me. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime that felt louder than it should have, and every instinct in my body told me to turn around before whoever was inside stepped out. But my feet did not move. They stayed planted against the polished floor, as if something invisible had decided for me that I was not leaving. Not yet. And then he appeared, stepping forward with the kind of quiet control that made everything else in the room seem less important without him saying a single word. He was taller than I expected, easily over 6 feet. His dark suit fitted perfectly like it had been made for him alone, and his presence carried something I could not name at first, not just confidence, not just wealth, but something sharper, something that made the air feel heavier as he walked toward me, his eyes locking onto the briefcase in my hand before lifting to meet mine. And in that moment, I understood that this was not just the owner. This was the kind of man people adjusted there. Lives around without even realizing it. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could see the details, the clean line of his jaw, the calm expression that did not reveal anything but still seemed to notice everything. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to make me aware of my own breathing, steady but shallow, controlled but not calm. And then he broke it, his voice low and even. "You found something that belongs to me." It was not a question, it was a statement, and I nodded once, shifting the briefcase slightly in my grip as I held it out toward him. "I think someone left it in my car," I said, keeping my tone level. I wanted to return it. He did not take it immediately, his gaze moving from the case to my face again, studying, measuring, like he was looking for something that was not obvious, and I felt it then. That same pressure I had felt since I walked in, the sense that this moment mattered in a way I did not fully understand yet. "How long did you have it?" he asked, his voice unchanged, but something in the question carried weight, like the answer mattered more than it should. "A few hours," I replied, my fingers tightening slightly on the handle before I forced them to relax. I noticed it after my last ride. He nodded once, slow, deliberate, and finally reached out, taking the briefcase. From me with a controlled motion, his hand steady, his grip firm but not forceful, and the second it left my hand, I felt something shift, not relief exactly, but a release, like I had just handed over more than an object, like I had stepped out of a decision that could have changed everything. He placed the case on the desk beside him without opening it, without even looking at it again, his attention returning fully to me, and that was when I realized this was not over, not for him. Most people would not bring this back, he said, his eyes narrowing just slightly, not in suspicion but in focus. Most people would not even consider it. I shrugged lightly, though the movement felt heavier than it should. I am not most people. The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something close enough to register, and for a brief second the tension in the room changed, softened, before settling back into something controlled again. "What is your name?" he asked. "Sarah," I answered, then added, "Sarah Mitchell." He repeated it quietly, like he was committing it to memory, "Sarah Mitchell," and then his gaze moved past me for a fraction of a second, toward the entrance, toward the world I had stepped out of, and when his eyes returned to mine, there was something different there, something more deliberate. "You came here alone," he said, not asking, just confirming, and I hesitated for the smallest moment before answering. "My son is in the car." Something in his expression shifted then, subtle but unmistakable, not surprise, not concern exactly, but recognition, like a new piece of information had just changed the shape of the situation in his mind. He looked at me for another second, longer this time, and then spoke again, his tone just as calm but carrying something new underneath it. "Bring him inside. It is too cold out there." The words landed heavier than they should have, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, like it was not a suggestion, not even an order, but a decision already made, and I stood there for a moment, caught between instinct and something else I could not yet define, before I realized that whatever this was, whatever I had just stepped into, it was not finished with me. Yet, I did not answer right away because no one had said something like that to me in a long time, not in that tone, not without hesitation or judgment or conditions attached, and I felt it land somewhere deeper than it should have, heavier than a simple sentence, because it was not just about the cold, it was about being seen, and I was not used to that anymore, not from people like him, not from people who lived in buildings like this and moved through the world like everything already belonged to them. I shifted my weight slightly, my hand still empty now that the briefcase was gone, and for a second I considered refusing, saying something polite and distant, keeping the line between our worlds exactly where it had always been. But then I pictured my son in the back seat, the thin blanket, the way his small shoulders curled in on themselves to stay warm, and the decision made itself before I could argue with it. "He will be okay for a minute," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, but his gaze did not leave mine, steady, waiting, like he already knew I was about to turn and go back out there. I nodded once, a small motion that felt larger than it was, and turned toward the door, aware of the way the room seemed to follow me as I moved, the quiet attention, the subtle shift of people who did not speak, but noticed everything, and the cold hit me again the second I stepped outside, sharper now after the warmth, like the night was reminding me exactly where I came from. I crossed the street quickly, my shoes slipping slightly on the wet pavement, my breath visible again as I reached the car and opened the back door, and my son stirred, blinking up at me with sleepy confusion, his voice soft and rough from sleep. "Mom, are we moving again?" And something in my chest tightened at the question, not because of the words but because of how normal it sounded to him now, like this was just how life worked. "No, sweetheart," I whispered, brushing his hair back gently. "Just come with me for a minute, okay? It is warmer inside." He nodded slowly, trusting, always trusting, and I helped him out, wrapping the blanket tighter around his shoulders. Before taking his hand in mine, his fingers small and cold against my skin, and we crossed back together, the building rising in front of us like something out of another life, and I felt it again, that invisible line. Only this time I was not stepping over it alone. The man by the door opened it again without a word, his eyes flicking briefly to my son before returning to neutral, and the warmth swallowed us whole as we stepped inside. My son's grip tightening slightly as he looked around, his eyes wide, taking in the lights, the space, the quiet that felt so different from the world we had just left. "It is okay," I murmured, squeezing his hand gently, though I was not entirely sure if I was reassuring him or myself. When we reached the desk again, he was still there, exactly where I had left him, like he had not moved at all. But the moment his eyes landed on my son, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable, a calculation adjusting, a detail being added to whatever picture he was building in his mind. "This is my son," I said, my voice steady even as I felt the weight of the moment pressing in. and my son looked up at him, curious, unafraid in the way children often are before they learn what to be afraid of. And for the first time since I had walked into that building, I saw something in the man's expression soften, not completely, not enough to change who he was, but enough to matter. He crouched slightly, just enough to lower himself to my son's level without breaking the calm authority he carried, and his voice, when he spoke again, was quieter, measured in a different way. "What is your name?" My son answered without hesitation, his small voice clear, and the man nodded once, acknowledging him with the same respect he had given me. And when he stood back up, his attention returned to me, but it was different now, more focused, more intentional, like something had shifted in a way neither of us could ignore. "You did the right thing bringing that back," he said, and this time it did not sound like an observation. It sounded like a conclusion, like a decision had just been made somewhere behind his eyes, and I realized then that whatever came next was not going to be random, it was going to be chosen. He did not say anything else right away, and that silence stretched just long enough to make me aware of every small detail again. The quiet hum of the lights above us, the faint echo of distant footsteps somewhere deeper in the building, the warmth that still felt unfamiliar against my skin, and my son's hand still wrapped tightly around mine like he was anchoring himself to the only thing he fully trusted in this room. And I realized that whatever he was thinking, whatever decision he had just made, it was not something he was going to explain, at least not yet. Instead, he turned slightly toward the man at the desk and gave a small nod, nothing dramatic, just a subtle motion that somehow carried weight. And the older man responded immediately, reaching for the phone again without a word, like this was a language they spoke without needing to say it out loud. And I felt it again, that quiet shift in the air, like something had just been set in motion behind the scenes. "You should sit down," he said, his attention returning to me, his tone calm, but firm in a way that made it clear this was not a suggestion meant to be ignored. And I hesitated for a fraction of a second before guiding my son toward a seating area nearby, the leather couch softer than anything we had touched in weeks. And when he sat down, he looked at me with a small, uncertain smile, like he did not quite understand what was happening, but knew it was different, knew it mattered. I stayed standing for a moment longer before sitting beside him, my posture straight, my senses still alert, because comfort felt like something I could not fully accept yet. Not here, not in a place where everything seemed controlled and intentional. He remained where he was for a second, watching us, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that felt deliberate, like he was taking in the full picture now, not just me, not just the briefcase, but everything that came with it. And then he walked over, each step measured, stopping just close enough that I could hear him without raising his voice. "When was the last time you had a proper place to stay?" he asked, and the question caught me off guard, not because of what he asked, but because of how direct it was. No hesitation, no attempt to soften it. Just the truth laid out in front of me like it was something he expected me to answer honestly. I looked down for a second, my hand brushing absently over my son's shoulder, grounding myself before I spoke. "A couple of weeks," I said finally, my voice steady, even though something inside me tightened at the admission. He nodded once, like he had expected that answer, like it confirmed something he had already begun to piece together, and his gaze shifted briefly to my son before returning to me. And I could see it now, clearer than before. This was not curiosity. This was assessment, not judgment, but evaluation, like he was deciding something that involved us whether I understood it or not. "You had an opportunity tonight," he said after a moment, his voice still even, still controlled. "You could have made a different choice." And for a second I thought he was going to leave it there, but then he added, "Most people would have." I met his eyes then, holding his gaze without looking away, because whatever this was, whatever he was trying to understand, I needed him to see that I was not going to shrink under it. Not now, not after everything. "I am not most people," I repeated quietly, and this time the words felt different, not defensive, not reactive, but grounded, like they belonged to me in a way they had not before. There was a pause, brief but heavy, and then something shifted again, not in the room, not in the people around us, but in him, subtle but undeniable, like a line had been crossed, like a decision had moved from consideration to certainty. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something that felt less like a test and more like a statement of intent. "Then I suppose it is time your circumstances reflected that." The next morning the sun had not fully risen yet, and the city outside the windows was still painted in shades of gray and gold, a quiet reminder that the world moved forward even when life felt suspended, and I held my son's hand a little tighter as we stepped into the apartment hallway, the soft hum of the heating system filling the space around us. Unfamiliar but comforting, a stark contrast to the cold nights in the car and the streets we had left behind. And as we entered the unit he had prepared for us, I was struck by how normal it looked, how ordinary it seemed for people who had never known what it was like to worry if the night would end without a place to sleep. And the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and something fresh, a welcome I had not expected but immediately felt grateful for. My son looking around with wide eyes, touching the smooth counter as if it was a new discovery, and I followed his gaze, letting myself notice details I had not allowed myself to see before: the clean floors, the light streaming through large windows, the small touches that suggested someone had thought about how it might feel to be here rather than just functionally live. And for a moment I could breathe, really breathe, without the weight of the streets pressing in. He stood back as I set the briefcase down on a table, still carefully closed, as if its presence in this apartment was somehow sacred. And he watched my son with that same measured attention, noting how he moved, how he adjusted the blanket around his shoulders, the small way he straightened the sleeves of his sweatshirt, the way his gaze darted curiously from one corner to the next, and I felt a quiet recognition in him, a calculation that this was not a passing moment, that what had brought us here mattered, and he was deciding how to make it matter in a way that would not simply pass. I sank onto the couch beside my son, still gripping his small hand, and he walked over, removing his coat with deliberate, precise movements and gesturing for us to relax while he remained upright, a presence that filled the room without forcing it. And I listened as he began to speak, explaining quietly that the building was ours to stay in, the apartment ready, the resources available for what we needed, and it was not a gift, not a handout, but an adjustment to a system we had been excluded from, a way to make what had been right the first time for everyone involved. And I could feel my chest loosen in a way it had not in years, the tightness of worry and exhaustion slipping slowly away. My son leaned against me, looking up at me with that trust that children have before they are taught to measure the intentions of others, and I realized that he had already begun to understand that this night was different, that this was the start of something new and stable, something I had not known I could expect. And when I looked at Daniel, standing there silently watching us adjust to the space, I could see the respect in his eyes, the acknowledgement that our presence here was not just accepted but recognized, and I felt the strange warmth of gratitude, mixed with relief and awe, that the person who could have remained distant had chosen to make it real, had chosen to turn an encounter with a briefcase into a new reality for us both. And in that moment I understood that some actions, small as they may seem, could ripple through a life and rearrange everything. And I sat there holding my son, the quiet of the apartment surrounding us, and for the first time in a long while, I did not feel invisible. The apartment settled into a quiet rhythm as the morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, painting the floor in stripes of gold and shadow, and I sat on the couch, watching my son explore the small space with cautious excitement. Every step he took a reminder that the world could still feel safe, that it could still hold something familiar even after the nights of uncertainty we had just endured. And I realized that I could finally let myself breathe, fully, without calculating every moment, or every dollar, or every risk. Because for the first time in a long while, someone had stepped in and made the uncertainty manageable, tangible, present in a way that felt deliberate and protective. Daniel stood near the kitchen, arms crossed, his gaze sweeping the room with that same quiet authority I had noticed from the first moment, not watching us like we were fragile or unworthy, but observing the way the apartment held us, how we moved, how we fit into the space. And I understood then that he saw us not as temporary occupants, but as something that mattered, as if our presence here had already been considered and calculated in a way that felt both intimidating and reassuring. I poured a cup of coffee for myself, the rich aroma filling the small kitchen, and the motion felt grounding, something ordinary amidst the extraordinary, and my son wandered over to the small table near the window, his hands tracing the edges of the surfaces, discovering the apartment as if it was entirely new. and I followed him with my eyes, feeling the tension I had carried for so long beginning to slip in small increments. He spoke finally, his voice calm but carrying weight. "This will change things for you. For him, for all of you." And I nodded, understanding that the decision he had made last night and reaffirmed this morning was not simply about providing a place to sleep or a safe environment, but about creating the conditions where life could take a different shape, where the small actions of honesty, integrity, and courage could ripple outward into something meaningful. And for the first time I could see it, the faint outline of a future that was not dictated solely by survival, but by possibility. My son looked up at me, eyes wide with that childlike certainty, and I reached out to smooth his hair, the warmth of the gesture lingering in a way that made me acutely aware of the fragility and strength intertwined in this moment. And Daniel moved closer, not imposing, not demanding, simply present, and the quiet of the apartment settled around us like a protective layer, a promise unspoken but felt deeply in the air, in the light, in the soft sounds of the city waking outside the window. He spoke again, softer this time, words chosen with care. "Everything you do now sets the tone for what comes next." And I felt the weight of responsibility, not as a burden, but as an opportunity, a chance to engage with life differently, to take ownership in ways that had been impossible until now. And I nodded, silent, acknowledging the gravity of his words and the sincerity behind them. My son laughed suddenly, a light sound that broke through the residual tension, and I smiled, allowing myself to lean back against the couch, feeling the solidity of the floor beneath my feet, the sun on my skin, and the quiet strength of being observed with respect, not judgment. For the first time in a long while, I felt that the day could be more than merely endured, that the moments we would live here would carry meaning, and I understood that this shift, small as it might seem to the world, was monumental to us, a change in rhythm, in pattern, in expectation, and I allowed myself to settle into it, fully present, knowing that the path forward, while uncertain, was guided by hands that had chosen to support us, to recognize us, and to ensure that what had begun with a simple act of honesty would flourish into something enduring and real. By evening, the apartment felt like it had always been ours, the light from the setting sun spilling across the floor in golden streaks that made the walls glow softly, and I watched my son move from the kitchen to the couch, his energy finally settling after a long day of discovery, exploring every corner with careful curiosity, touching surfaces that felt solid and permanent, and I realized that for the first time in years, he had a space that belonged to him, that felt safe, that was ours to shape and inhabit. I leaned back, letting my shoulders relax against the couch, and Daniel remained standing nearby, observing quietly, his presence still commanding without intruding, a reminder that everything here was measured and deliberate. And yet I did not feel afraid. I felt steady, supported, like the world had shifted just enough to create a place where we could breathe, move, and plan for what came next. He spoke after a moment, his voice calm but carrying weight. "It is not just about providing shelter," he said. "It is about creating a rhythm, a pattern where you can thrive." And I nodded, understanding that the meaning of his words extended beyond the walls, beyond the immediate comfort, and into the way our lives could now unfold with possibility, intention, and care. That the choices we made would be framed by this opportunity, this environment where the smallest actions could have significance and consequence in the best sense, a lesson in trust and consequence interwoven with our survival. My son curled up next to me, leaning into my side with that quiet confidence only a child who feels protected can have, and I felt warmth spread through me, not from the sun or the apartment, but from knowing that this was real, that our lives could shift without warning, that an act as simple as returning a briefcase could ripple outward and change the trajectory of everything we had assumed about our future, that integrity and courage, even when exercised quietly, had value, tangible and lasting. Daniel moved closer, setting down a small package on the coffee table without a word, a practical gesture that carried meaning, and I recognized the care behind it, the attention to detail, the thought that had gone into ensuring that we were not just safe for a moment, but equipped to begin building a life here with dignity and consistency. I watched him, noticing the subtle way he adjusted his stance, the precise timing of his movements, the quiet assessment in his eyes that conveyed respect and expectation simultaneously, and I understood that he saw not just our current circumstances, but our potential, and he was choosing to support it deliberately. I felt a sense of calm settle over me, a rare and precious state that allowed me to think beyond immediate survival, to imagine a future where decisions could be guided by intention, not desperation, and I realized that the most profound changes often arrive unexpectedly, catalyzed by acts that seem small but carry consequences beyond comprehension. My son laughed softly, the sound pure and unguarded, and I smiled in response, letting the simplicity of that moment anchor me, while Daniel remained in the room, a silent guardian of that new reality, a reminder that some people choose to create stability and opportunity for others not as a favor, but because they recognize the value of integrity, courage, and humanity. And as I looked at him, at my son, and at this space we now inhabited, I knew that the trajectory of our lives had shifted in a way that would endure, a testament to the quiet power of deliberate choice and the unexpected consequences of honesty and bravery.